More than 20 years before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, a group of Franciscan missionaries left their native Spain to evangelize and minister to the indigenous Guale people of the South Georgia coast. Known familiarly as the Georgia Martyrs, or the Five Friars of Georgia, these servants of God were murdered for their fidelity to Christian teaching on the sanctity of marriage. Their cause for beatification was formally opened on February 22, 1984. My friends, while the story you are about to see began more than 400 years ago, it did not end in 1597. The seeds of faith that were planted by the friars and watered in their blood continue to bear abundant fruit in South Georgia today. Our local church is alive, aflame with the love of God that burns ever brightly, but never consumes. As Bishop of the Diocese of Savannah, I would like to invite you to meet Friar Pedro de Corpa, Friar Blas Rodriguez, Friar Miguel de Añón, Friar Antonio de Badajoz, and Friar Francisco de Berascola, our ancestors in faith who gave all they had for the sake of the gospel.
It is September 14th, 1597. Friar Pedro de Corpa prays on his knees in his home. He's 37 years old. It's the last day of his life. The steamy, humid summer morning in coastal Georgia has almost turned to fall. Behind the friar, a party of young native men stand in the peaceful village of Tolomato, near modern-day Darien, Georgia, their faces streaked with war paint and their hands gripping clubs known as macanas. Leading the group is Juanillo, heir to the paramount chief of the Guale tribe. The warriors strike suddenly and without warning.
They kill him by using a macana, which is somewhat of a club that the Guale used at that time for war. And the macana, they would simply use it to hit people on the head, and it was an immediate death, a strong blow to the head. We know that after Pedro was killed, Juanillo takes his head, he's decapitated, and they place his head on top of a pole and place the head of Pedro close to the water where the mission of Tolomato was, as a warning of what had happened.
The sultry salt marshes of what is now coastal Georgia in the southeastern United States will soon run red with the blood of 5 Spanish missionaries. Though many details are lost in the mists of time, the chilling events of these fateful days are forever seared into the memory of the Church. The murderous rampage continues. On September 16th, the war party comes for Friar Blas Rodriguez, who serves the mission in the nearby village of Tupiqui. Friar Blas begs his killers to let him say Mass before they murder him, and the Indians consent.
He was allowed to celebrate Mass before his death, and knowing that he was going to die, distributed everything he had to the people around him.
The young men seize all of the sacred objects from the church. Knowing he is going to be murdered, Friar Blas's final act is one of generosity and forgiveness. 2 agonizing days later, Father Blas's life is cut short by a macana blow to the head. Further south, on what is now known as St. Catherine's Island, 2 more Franciscans are warned that trouble is coming. Brother Antonio de Badajoz and Friar Miguel de Añón refuse to abandon their parishioners at the mission of Guale.
They're told that you're going to die. But where do you really run, I mean, when you're in the middle of a palmetto forest, they make a decision that they're not going to leave. They made a choice not to abandon the Guale people, even though it almost certainly meant their death.
On September 17th, Friar Miguel celebrates Mass and leads Friar Antonio in 4 hours of prayer. Historical research has revealed that the priests were celebrating the feast of the Stigmata of St. Francis, their patron.
So if you were facing death, what an incredible liturgy to celebrate.
Death comes more cruelly for the two men. At first, the war party hesitates to kill the beloved priests. But then an unbaptized Indian rushes forward and beats Friar Miguel with his macana. A second warrior deals the death blow to both men. Some days later, Friar Francisco de Verascala is returning to his mission of Assao. Guale warriors surprise the tall, athletic Spaniard as he lands his dugout canoe while wearing a hat, pulling him onto the shore and killing him with repeated blows from their macanas.
He might have even waved to his attackers. I don't think he really knew what was coming. And they probably wouldn't have given him much of an opportunity to defend himself because he was so vigorous and so strong.
When he got out, he thought he was being greeted and was embraced and in fact killed right on the spot. So that could very well have been a recognition, this is a powerful man. And if we are going to kill him, we know that there's going to be a struggle.
A sixth friar, Francisco de Avila, narrowly escapes the same fate when a war party corners him inside at the Talapo mission on present-day Jekyll Island. Wounded, beaten, and tortured, Friar Francisco is forced to endure 9 months of captivity, but escapes the ordeal with his life.
Friar Francisco de Avila is the one who got away. He's the one who lives to tell the story.
What sparked the murders of the 5 friars? It all hinges on their steadfast defense of a single sacrament of the Church.
There was no negotiation on that. This is what you, through your baptism, professed to do.
What was the sacrament for which these 5 men were willing to die? To answer that question, we first need to explore what brought the Franciscans to this remote outpost of the Spanish Empire on the coast of modern-day Georgia.
Looking at the history of the Spanish evangelization of coastal Georgia, we see a story that really goes against what many of us hear and learn as we grow up.
Most Americans are raised on an oversimplified narrative that paints English colonists as heroes and Spanish as villains.
There is an incredible difference between the English and Spanish perspective. First of all, when it comes to evangelization, the English did not come to the New World to evangelize. The Spanish did.
We see a lot about how cruel and evil Europeans were to Native Americans, and this is a story of just the opposite.
We see that the Spanish were here many, many years before Jamestown and before the Pilgrims, and also a presence that shows quite a bit of collaboration with the natives, rather than the typical story that one hears that the Spanish came and they just slaughtered everyone.
By the late 16th century, Spain had changed the way it established colonies in the New World. The violent conquest which characterized the empire's earlier expansions had been replaced by a more spiritual ethos, focused on bringing the indigenous people into the Catholic faith.
They start out with the most fundamental debate, are these people even human? Do they have souls? And once it's decided that yes, they have souls, then you have a moral obligation that is paramount to save those souls.
Spain had a system of slavery, but it was much different than what we call the chattel slavery of the English. In the Spanish system, you still had rights. You could make appeals to judges. You could buy yourself freedom. It's still a person. Okay, that person is a slave, which is horrific, but you cannot deny that that is an individual person who has a soul. In the English system, there was absolutely no recognition of the person as a person.
And it stretched Catholic thinking. Before that, really, the idea was the gospel had already gotten to the ends of the earth. And now suddenly there was this whole another continent of people who had never heard the gospel. And so these men, driven by their passion for the Lord, they went literally to the ends of the earth.
As opposed to their English rivals, who would soon arrive with colonies to the north, the Spanish, by this time, had abolished the enslavement of Native Americans and gave the natives certain rights as subjects of the Spanish Empire.
The Spanish passed the new laws of 1542, which make it illegal to enslave Indians.
The natives were respected as part of the empire, where the Spanish wanted the natives to be part of what they were doing when compared to who the English thought the natives were and what role or no role the natives were going to play.
The object of Spain's efforts on the coast north of St. Augustine, Florida, in present-day Georgia, were the Guale, a now vanished tribe which once populated between the Ogeechee River in the north and the Altamaha River in the south. At first, Spain sent Jesuit missionaries in an attempt to bring the Guale into the Catholic faith and under Spanish control.
The Jesuits really aren't quite ready for this level of cultural difference, the gaps that they have to bridge.
They were a more, I would say, rigid group, kind of law and order group, black and white group. I mean, they believed in things yes and no, and nothing in between.
The Jesuits were founded in the 16th century, so when they came to Florida among the Guale, they were really a recent order. And they were all highly educated, and they literally came in almost like academics explaining everything. And because of that sort of rigorous dogmatic approach, they didn't get many converts.
They were there to provide, to teach, and then to leave. Whereas the friars, we believed that it took time for people to come to a certain point of belief.
Where the Jesuits failed, Franciscan friars found a fertile mission field suited to their more relaxed philosophy.
The Franciscans come later. They have 70 years of experience working in Mexico, working in Peru, working in Central America, and they have a system for acquire the language, learn about the culture, figure out what the cultural idioms are, and then use those to communicate. Because abstract concepts like the dichotomy of good and evil are difficult to translate without a good understanding of local idioms.
Well, the Franciscans were actually the first to go out and begin integrating themselves into the Guale as residents. They were accepted into the communities in part because they came out sort of like a Peace Corps effort.
They also permitted the Native Americans to integrate some of their own practices into their new Catholic faith, such as burying their dead with grave goods in the mission churchyard, or fashioning Guale faces into the carvings on the Stations of the Cross in the mission churches.
The flavor of Christianity, of Catholicism that was developed in a Franciscan mission province to some extent reflected local practice.
The Franciscan missionaries serving with the Guale were among the best and brightest Spain and the Catholic Church had to offer.
These were men who had been educated in some of the finest schools in Spain. These were like astronauts. These were amazing people.
These are some of the top people that are being sent. In other words, educators, novice masters, leaders of the community, famous preachers. They understood themselves as an international vanguard in many ways. There was no other idea of life that was more compelling than being a missionary. Francis of Assisi himself was a missionary.
Friar Pedro de Corpa, the first missionary to die in 1597, was one of the most experienced in the region. He had a good command of the local Guale language, and his mission in the village of Tolomato, which was essentially the capital of the Guale chiefdom, was the most prominent in the region. Friar Pedro de Corpa was born in a small farming town in the Villalbilla region of Spain.
If you go to the parish church of Villalbilla today, you can see the baptismal font where Pedro de Corpa was baptized. We know that he was the most seasoned, the most experienced. He had been here the longest compared to some other friars. And Pedro de Corpa was warmly embraced. He lived among the Guale without a military presence, without soldiers. He was welcomed by the Guale and was effective in baptizing them and building a mission and serving as the head missionary.
Friar Blas Rodriguez, who served the mission in the village of Tupiqui, was in his 50s when he died.
Friar Blas was from the Spanish province of Wanos, which is in western Spain, close to the present-day Portuguese border. He joined the Franciscans, and in 1590, he responded to the invitation to come to the New World. Apart from some general characteristics that we know about him, not very much is known about him.
Friars Antonio de Badajoz and Miguel de Añón, who served together at the mission on St. Catherine's Island, were a study in contrasts. Friar Miguel was beloved by the Guale. He was known for his pleasant singing voice. Historical sources indicate Friar Miguel was born in either Saragossa or Huesca province in Spain, and that he sacrificed a great deal to come to the New World.
We're told by sources that he came from a noble family, had an incredible disposition, and clearly was quite persuasive, and is here an example of, if you will, sending the best of the best to Florida.
Friar Miguel's companion brother Antonio, who hailed from the village of La Abuela in the province of Badajoz, was an older man who knew the Guale language well enough to translate for Friar Miguel.
Now, Brother Antonio is not Father Antonio, it's Brother Antonio, which means he's what's called a lay brother. In other words, he was not ordained. His focus was on the community life and working hand in hand with Father Miguel.
The last missionary to die, Friar Francisco de Veráscola, stands out among his brothers in the historical record. We know more about him than any of the other martyred missionaries. Friar Francisco was the only Basque among the group, born on February 13, 1564, to a noble family in the village of Guale, and baptized at the parish church of San Juan de Molinar. His father, Domingo, was a government official known for carrying out social reforms to benefit the poor. 33-year-old Francisco was a natural athlete who used his strength and skill to build rapport with the Guale.
When Father Francisco comes, it's noted right away that he is quite tall. He's a younger friar, and there is a source that talks about him being one who wrestled with Indians and took part in the javelin tosses. And this account, I don't know if it's propaganda or just the Spanish view, but they said that he was always a winner, especially when he was wrestling. And so he was often recognized, if you will, in stories down through the years as one who was incredibly athletic.
Things were going well with the Georgia coastal missions until a young man named Juanillo, who was heir to the leading Guale chief and a baptized Catholic, requested that Friar Pedro make an exception to Catholic teachings. This would set off a bloody revolt that would change the entire leadership of the Guale culture. To make it easier for recent converts to adapt local customs to Catholic teachings, the Franciscan missionaries were willing to mold to some traditions. But Juanillo wanted the friars to bend the rules for him. He wanted a second wife, a practice which was common among Guale leaders. Juanillo's request was rooted in local custom and in economics.
Well, the Franciscans were actually the first, in part because they were coming out and becoming religious practitioners for the converted villages. But the Franciscans were definitely willing to accept those things that were not, theologically problematic, but practice-wise would accommodate traditional practices wherever they were. So in other words, the Catholicism that was developed in a Franciscan mission province to some extent reflected local practice.
In the Guale culture, the women had the wealth. So a man who could have multiple wives would be wealthy.
The more wives you have, the more money you have. It's sort of a conspicuous consumption thing.
And so you can see why they would want to have more wives. You can see in their understanding of their culture.
The Church's commands regarding the sacrament of marriage were clear. The answer to the chief de mayor's request was an unequivocal no.
Juanillo was very disappointed and actually very angry with the friars for insisting that he could not be an exception, that he would have to abide by the Catholic faith now that he's been baptized.
And Juanillo wanted to go back to the old ways, but he also wanted to receive the host, right? He wanted to be Catholic, but he didn't want to live by the rules of Catholicism.
The friars' staunch refusal to grant the request also caused an earthquake in the Guale political structure.
And so when the friars said, no, that's not appropriate for a Christian, they essentially interfered in chiefly succession by disinheriting and choosing a different chief instead of the legitimate Guale leader.
The friars probably did not understand what they had set in motion, but they could not deviate from the Church's teaching on the sacraments.
But it essentially implied if he did not follow their admonition, he could not become the Mico Mayor.
In the aftermath of the 5 murders, new leaders emerged to rule in the coastal villages, and over time, a rival Guale chief named Don Domingo took bloody revenge for the friars' deaths and made peace with the Spanish authorities. Historians point out that it is Don Domingo's version of events which have shaped the official narrative.
This is what kind of creates this mystery for us, because the friars were clearly a target, but it's not clear whether they were the only target. It's possible that indigenous leaders like Don Domingo are then taking advantage of that and leveraging it for their own purposes.
So some would suggest that this revolt of Juanillo was not simply Juanillo and his grievances, but it was more of a general uprising in which a number of different chiefs were involved.
Regardless of the various factors which played into the decision to murder the missionaries, it is believed that Friar de Corpa's staunch defense of marriage is the match which lit the fire. And the friars all knew that they had placed their lives on the line when they left everything behind and sailed for the New World.
These Franciscans came sort of with the understanding that part of their mission might involve martyrdom. These were people who did not shy away from the notion of dying, trying to spread their faith.
It's similar to someone joining the armed forces in the United States and going to a place of conflict, knowing that they may never come back. They believe in the gospel and in the message of Jesus Christ so strongly that they're willing to give their life in defense of it.
In the years after their deaths, the friars' sacrifice was chronicled by Luis Geronimo de Ora, a Peruvian Franciscan who visited the area in the early 17th century and interviewed Spanish officials and native eyewitnesses. The story was also repeated in Friar Alonso Gregorio de Escobedo's epic poem, La Florida. There is also evidence that the deaths of these brave men didn't end Catholicism in the area. Instead, it helped the faith to become more deeply rooted among local Native Americans. A group of Catholic Indians from the Timucua tribe bravely refused to recant their faith near present-day Darien, Georgia in 1661.
Instead of rejecting Christianity in the face of death, Creek Indians were basically presenting them with that option. Abandon the Christian God and come with us or die. Many of them chose to be burned and martyrs' deaths.
The faith took hold, and that it's important to remember that as we think of the legacy of the friars, that not only are we remembering them now 400 years later, but for the time that the missions existed up until the late 1600s when the English demolished them all, the Guale continued, they remained Catholic, they remained faithful.
The story of the 5 martyred friars has led to archaeological digs and important discoveries on the barrier islands. Over the past century, more than one effort has been made to bring attention to the sacrifice of these defenders of the faith. Starting in the 1940s, church leaders in Friar Francisco de Verascolo's home province in Spain pressed for sainthood for all 5 of the Franciscans. Particular attention was paid to Friar Francisco, who was the subject of several paintings and a plaque. A cross was erected in Francisco's honor in 1967.
There has been an annual commemoration of Friar Francisco in his hometown. There is a marker in his hometown that shows where he was born. Earlier on in the 20th century, the bishop of that area was very, very interested in the beatification process to try to name him the patron saint of soccer because of his love of sport and his ability to share the gospel with others through sport.
On the site where Friar Miguel de Añón and Brother Antonio de Badajoz were killed, in 1984, archaeologists discovered the remains of the mission of Guale on St. Catherine's Island, with 431 Christian buried remains of baptized Guale natives. The bishop of the Diocese of Savannah conducted a prayer service at the site in memory of the Guale men, women, and children buried there. Over the ensuing decades, archaeological surveys have continued. Discoveries have included countless artifacts, revealing the daily lives of the Guale Indians on the island both before and after the missionaries arrived.
The idea was to create something that feels like a place someone might want to pray, feels like a church, represents the church, but still allows archaeologists to be able to do the work if they need to, and also allows visitors to come there and pray without having sand spurs in their knees. We've had so many masses in the last few years with local Catholic churches coming with their priest, and it was stirring to watch how moved they were to be at that place.
The site of the mission church has been turned into a living memorial, marked by palm trees planted in the shape of the vanished structure.
When I got there, my first visit there, I really felt that I was on holy ground. And so it was a very, very moving experience for me to be on that island and to be able to celebrate the sacrament of the Eucharist on or near the very same spot that they did.
Providentially coinciding with the discovery of the mission of Guale was the opening of the cause for the beatification of Friar Pedro de Corpa and companions by the Franciscan Holy Name Province in New York and the Catholic Diocese of Savannah. They believe these men died as martyrs for the faith due to their defense of the sacrament of marriage.
Whenever a cause for beatification or canonization is presented to Rome, there always has to be an organization that is sponsoring it, that is responsible for the promotion of it, for the research, for all the various steps that are required. The priests throughout the years who have led this effort have been Franciscan friars of the Holy Name province. It is only in the last few years that the Diocese of Savannah, in conjunction with the Holy Name province, has taken a more active role when it comes to promoting the story of the martyrs.
Over the years, many people have helped carry the torch for the cause. Father Charles Bird, a parish priest, commissioned the creation of a retablo, a small painting depicting the 5 Franciscans.
It begins the process of giving these very real men who we know lived a personality, and that helps us to connect to them.
Unlike many saints, there are no surviving physical remains of Friar de Corpa and his companions.
In terms of the beatification process, it is important to know where the body is, to find a body, for there to be a place where the faithful can go and pray. It's usually tied to a place of pilgrimage, a place to gather. So unfortunately, with these 5 friars, we do not have their bodies, any of them.
The bodies of Friar Pedro de Corpa, Friar Blas Rodriguez, and Friar Francisco de Verascola were all eventually buried near the spots where they died and have never been found. Spanish soldiers discovered the mangled remains of Friar Miguel Añón and Brother Antonio Barajos, buried near the entrance to their church on St. Catherine's Island. Some or all of the bones were brought back to Spanish headquarters in St. Augustine, where they remained until 1763, when they likely were moved to Havana, Cuba. Over the centuries, the relics have been lost, but the story of the 5 friars and the stand they made for the sacrament of marriage remain as an inspiration for Christians today.
I think at this time, the Georgia martyrs play a very important role in upholding the institution of marriage and the holiness of marriage and the covenant and the commitment of marriage. Because what we're finding today is a trend in being rather casual about marriage. If things don't work out, we just separate and we end our relationship and we look for someone else to marry or to have a relationship with. There isn't that sense of commitment, that level of commitment that existed years ago, and certainly in the times of these martyrs. I think more than ever, what the 5 Georgia martyrs have brought to us is a greater respect for one another and the commitments that we make to one another.
The lives of Pedro de Corpa and his companion friars are an example for each and every one of us of courage, of courageous living.
We have great admiration, respect, and even devotion to martyrs in our church history, those who have died in defending the faith. And they become heroes in our life. They become the heroes for the Christians of today.
What we need to do as Catholics is to appreciate broadly our Catholic history, to know that we have a history that's rich and that's deep. And part of that is to know the story of the 5 Georgia martyrs. This great international epic reality of Roman Catholicism, that has a story in every part of the world, in every corner of the world, has a rich story here in Georgia.
For you, for me, as people living 400 years later, it's important for us to learn their story, to know what they did, who they were, why were they here, why did they give up their lives for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of the defense of marriage. Also, we can share this message. We learn, but then we share. We share what we have learned. We share with our friends. We share with our communities. We share with our churches so that others may come to know their story and be inspired by the way that they have lived their life. And finally, all of us can pray. Pray for the cause. pray that these men's heroic sacrifice, may be recognized by the Church and offered to all the faithful as an example of virtuous living, of gospel-driven life.
thegeorgiamartyrs.org.
Thank you for watching. I encourage you to visit the Martyrs Monument at Nativity of Our Lady Church in Darien, or any of the numerous pilgrimage sites associated with the friars, a list of which can be found online. The Diocese of Savannah, along with the Franciscan Holy Name Province, which is now part of the newly formed Province of Our Lady of Guadalupe, have sought the beatification of the Georgia martyrs, so that the faithful may look to these servants of God as heavenly intercessors for those seeking to be faithful to Christ's teaching on marriage. Their beatification would serve as a tribute to the Catholic faithful of the Guale nation, for whom the friars gave their lives, and who in turn loved and honored them at the time of their deaths and beyond. It would also recognize the contribution of Spanish-speaking peoples to Catholic life in the United States, whose missionary ancestors came to America to enrich the indigenous peoples with the gospel of Jesus Christ. I ask you to pray for the continued progress of the cause and to invoke the intercession of the Georgia martyrs, particularly in matters of marriage and family life. And now, let us lift up an intention and together pray the Martyr's Prayer. O Lord Jesus Christ, reward the apostolic zeal of Friar Pedro de Corpa and his 4 companion friars, Blas, Miguel, Antonio, and Francisco, who labored for the spiritual well-being of the native Guale people of Georgia and gave their lives in witness to the Christian faith. Through their merits and intercession, graciously grant the favor I humbly ask of you, so that for the glory of your name, their heroic sacrifice may be officially recognized by the Church. Amen.